She was 25 and homeless. No lease. No family key. No place to return to. Just a canvas satchel and $47.83 shred she had saved from hemming curtains after midnight. And with that money, she bought a stamped tin ceiling studio for $3 outside Bramwell, Mercer County, West Virginia, where the workshop had vanished from trade maps in 1978. Rain had opened a 6-foot wound in the roof. The brick chimney leaned 2 inches toward the creek. The county condemned it on October 3rd, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But inside the Flywheel die press was a sealed chamber untouched for decades, holding $21,576, a handwritten trade journal, and the unfinished history of her own family. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sylvie Mercer had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Beckley, she measured rooms by the number of careful steps between one closed door and another. Her father left before she remembered his voice, and her mother, Elaine, moved them through 4 rentals in 9 years. Sylvie learned that a house could look settled while every box beneath the bed remained taped. Elaine worked a department store cosmetics counter and kept her shoes polished through snow weeks. When bills arrived, she opened them with a butter knife, stacked them by color, and said nothing until the lights stayed on another month. The only place Sylvie was allowed to make a mess belonged to her grandfather, Amos Mercer, who kept a narrow metalworking shed behind his house near Hinton. Every Saturday he warmed the coal stove, buttoned a brown canvas apron over his shirt, and set 2 squares of tin plate on the bench. He restored stamped ceiling panels from courthouses, pharmacies, and mountain hotels. Sylvie held the wiping rag while he cleaned old dies with kerosene, then watched him dust the steel faces with graphite so the sheet would release cleanly after the strike. After lunch, Amos let her align one corner beneath the small hand press, always checking twice that her fingers rested beyond the guide pins. Metal remembers every careless hand, he told her. He meant that damage was rarely sudden. It began as a shortcut, skipped measurement, a pressure applied before the piece was ready. Amos died during a wet March when Sylvie was 19. Relatives had emptied the shed before she arrived. The dies pattern book, snips, wooden mallets, and sample panels were sold as mixed salvage. She found only his apron hanging behind the stove, one pocket stiff with graphite. Elaine folded it into a grocery bag and placed it in the trunk without speaking. 3 years later, Elaine married Warren Pike, a property manager with pale cuffs, quiet shoes, and a habit of straightening objects that did not belong to him. He never raised his voice. He simply altered the temperature of a room until everyone else moved more carefully. He timed Sylvie's showers and called her sewing table temporary storage. When he entered the kitchen, Elaine lowered the radio before he asked. On October 18th, 2122, Sylvie came home carrying a paper sack of thread spools and found Amos's apron folded on the porch beside her suitcase. Warren stood inside the screen door, one hand resting on its brass latch. 8 words. Nothing more. Sylvie looked past him toward her mother. Elaine stood beside the sink with both hands around a dry coffee cup. Her thumb moved once across the rim. She did not meet Sylvie's eyes, did not reach for the latch, did not say her daughter's name. Warren closed the inner door with the careful pressure of a man protecting fresh paint. Sylvie lifted the suitcase, tucked the grocery bag beneath her arm, and walked until the porch light disappeared behind Rain. For 6 weeks she slept wherever closing hours left a little mercy. In Charleston she spent 4 nights upright in the bus terminal. In Huntington she slept beneath a church stairwell, then inside a laundromat beside dryers that made the concrete warm. She paid $12 for a hostel bunk and 70 cents each morning for coffee that bought 2 hours indoors. Her money fell from $81.46 to $93.20, then to $61.08. She mended a waitress's apron for $5 and replaced 3 pearl buttons on a funeral blouse for $7. She rode east to Bluefield and slept one night in the back seat of an unlocked station wagon behind a repair shop, leaving before dawn and placing 2 folded dollars beneath the windshield wiper. The next afternoon, she entered the Bluefield Area Transit Library branch to warm her hands around a radiator. A corkboard stood near the public telephone, layered with tutoring notices, feed prices, and apartments she could not afford. Beneath a yellow card advertising mason jars, a county auction notice had curled at both corners. Abandoned commercial structure, former Mercer ornamental metal studio. Minimum bid $3. Buyer assumes all liens, hazards, and demolition responsibility. Sylvie read it twice. At the bottom, someone had penciled a correction to the viewing address and drawn a small 8-point tin rosette beside it. The shape was one Amos had taught her to center beneath the press. She counted her remaining money at a library table, $47.83. Then she copied the bus route, wrapped Amos's apron inside her spare shirt, and bought a one-way ticket toward Bramwell. By nightfall, the $3 studio was no longer an advertisement. It was the only door in the mountains that might still open for her. The bus left Bluefield before sunrise, carrying Sylvie through folds of mountain fog that opened and closed around the road like grey curtains. She changed vehicles once in Princeton, then rode a county shuttle as far as the driver would take her along US Route 52. From there, the corrected auction address was still 11 miles away. She walked 6 before cold rain turned the shoulder slick, her suitcase wheels clogging with red mud. That night she slipped into a hay barn with one door hanging loose, spread Amos's apron beneath her cheek, and slept between square bales while the temperature fell to 31 degrees. By morning, frost had silvered the pasture fence. Sylvie walked the remaining 5 miles with damp socks and a heel blister that opened before she saw Bramwell's first rooftops. The village seemed to have been arranged along the Tug Fork by someone unwilling to cut down a single mountain. She passed the corner shop cafe with steam clouding its windows, Whitlow Hardware beneath a faded red awning, the Bramwell Drug Company's narrow brick front, Gable's Feed and Seed with burlap sacks stacked beside the door, and Hensley's barber shop where a striped pole turned without urgency. None of them was open yet. A delivery man sweeping flour from a bakery step watched her suitcase rattle over the pavement, but did not ask where she belonged. The Mercer County clerk's satellite office occupied 2 rooms behind the former bank. Sylvie entered at 9 carrying rain on her coat, and the auction notice softened from repeated folding. The front room smelled of floor wax, paper dust, and the electric heater beneath a row of metal chairs. Behind the counter sat a woman with a white streak through the center of her black hair. She wore a silver thimble on the smallest finger of her left hand, though there was no sewing in sight. The brass plate before her read MRS. Lucille Hale, Deputy Clerk. Lucille studied the notice. Then Sylvie's suitcase. Yes, ma'am? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not repair the access road. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Lucille removed her glasses and cleaned one lens with the edge of her sleeve. Most people ask what happens if they change their minds. The clerk put her glasses back on. A corner of her mouth moved, but not quite into a smile. The auction had received no other bid. Sylvie placed 3 $1 bills on the counter. Lucille flattened them beneath her palm, as if a draft might carry away the entire transaction, then turned the deed toward her and pointed to 3 marked lines. Sylvie signed each one slowly. The old brass recording stamp came down with a heavy click, pressing the date into the page. Lucille gave her directions without consulting a map. Take Route 52 east to the old Coal Tipple Road. Pass the stone church and keep left where the pavement ends. You will see a rusted mailbox with no door. The studio is half a mile beyond it, down near Laurel Creek. She slid the deed into a manila envelope, then stopped with her fingers still resting on the flap. Mercer, she said. Your people from Summers County. My grandfather lived near Hinton. Amos Mercer. The silver thimble tapped once against the counter. Lucille stood and crossed to a cabinet behind her. From the bottom drawer she removed a ledger wrapped in blue cloth. She opened it near the centre, following entries with one blunt fingernail until she found a name written in brown ink. Amos came here in 1966, she said. He copied 3 ceiling patterns before the shop closed. My father drove the county truck then. Said Amos spent 2 days measuring one rosette because the original die had worn unevenly. Sylvie touched the edge of the counter. He never told me. Men of that generation mistook silence for safekeeping. Lucille looked again at the surname on the deed. The former owner was Enoch Mercer. I cannot tell you how close the relation was. Records were lost in the courthouse flood. But Amos did not come here by accident. She placed the envelope in Sylvie's hands. Before releasing it, she slipped one of the $3 bills into her desk drawer. For the record, Lucille said. It was... The county has its receipt. She closed the drawer. That one belongs to the story. Outside the rain had thinned to a cold mist. Sylvie followed Route 52 past the stone church and turned where Lucille had instructed. The pavement narrowed, broke into patches, and finally surrendered to gravel. A woman in a green cardigan was gathering split wood beside a cottage. She raised 2 fingers in greeting without stopping her work. At her boots, an elderly black dog watched Sylvie pass, gave one uncertain bark, then returned to smelling the woodpile. The rusted mailbox stood beyond a ditch choked with goldenrod. Half a mile farther, 2 black walnut trees appeared above a low bank, their bare branches crossing over the lane. Beneath them waited the studio. It was smaller than Sylvie had imagined, perhaps 28 feet long and 18 feet wide, built from darkened poplar boards over a stone foundation. Corrugated metal covered most of the roof, though one section had peeled backward around the 6-foot opening. The chimney rose from the western wall with a visible lean. Above the double doors hung a tin sign nearly black with age. When Sylvie wiped it with her sleeve, raised letters emerged beneath the soot. Ceilings. Cornices. Panels. One hinge had pulled loose from the left door. She lifted the sagging edge with both hands, pushed her shoulder against the planks, and felt swollen wood give a fraction at a time. The sound carried into the building, deep and reluctant. Cold air met her first, smelling of wet stone mouse nests and the faint mineral odor of old metal. A strip of daylight fell through the roof onto the front room, where it touched a work table and scattered silver across the dust. Somewhere inside the wall, water ticked into a pan with the regularity of a clock. Her boots disturbed grit that rasped beneath the soles. She tasted rust when she breathed through her mouth. Along the northern wall, shelves held warped wooden forms and coils of wire gone green. The front room had once served customers. A waist-high counter faced the entrance, its top marked by hundreds of small cuts. When Sylvie laid her palm against it, the wood felt colder than the air. The back room was heavier with machinery. A long-foot shear stood beside a roller, both furred with oxidation. The largest object occupied the centre, a cast-iron die press taller than Sylvie's shoulder, with a broad flywheel and a bed blackened by old oil. She brushed the wheel with 2 fingers. Beneath the dust, the iron was smooth. A creak moved behind the building, close enough that she could hear water turning over stone. The sound entered through cracks in the boards and softened the silence without breaking it. She found a hand pump in the yard, but the handle would not move. There was no working light, no heat, and no door she could secure properly. Still, she returned to the front room, swept a space with a broken corn broom, and laid her coat across the floorboards. She ate crackers from her satchel and drank the last of the water she had carried from town. After dark, the roof opening framed 3 hard stars. Wind passed across it with a low bottle note, and the loose sign tapped once against the wall whenever the gust strengthened. Sylvie wrapped herself in Amos's apron and listened until she could distinguish the creak, the sign, the dripping pan, and the careful settling of the old press. Before sleep, she reached beneath the apron and placed one hand flat on the floor. What is made carefully can still carry a life forward. At first light, Sylvie went outside and worked the pump handle until rust loosened from the joint in orange flakes. The first water came brown, then cloudy, then clear enough to catch the sky. She filled a dented kettle, marked the well as usable, and followed a narrow path behind the walnut trees to an outhouse leaning toward the creek. One hinge had failed, but the pit was dry and the roof still held. During the next 3 days she learned the studio by sound. The third board inside the front door complained in 2 notes. A plank beside the workbench gave a soft click under her left heel but remained firm. Near the press, the floor changed from hollow resonance to the dense, muted answer of stone footings. At night, those small distinctions became a map she could cross without a lamp. She walked into town on the 4th morning with a list folded inside her glove. Whitlow hardware smelled of machine oil, seed potatoes, cedar shavings, and the coal stove glowing near the register. Glass jars of screws stood behind the counter beside hand-lettered boxes that had outlived their manufacturers. The proprietor was a square-built man in his late 60s with one eyebrow entirely white and the other still black. He wore a carpenter's pencil behind each ear. "Walter Whitlow," he said, though the name was painted above the till. "You bought the Mercer place?" He read her list without comment, then glanced toward her boots, the damp cuffs of her trousers, and the old canvas apron folded over one arm. "I have $39.80, she said. "I need the chimney safe before the next freeze." Walter turned the paper over and began writing figures on the back. "Cash will buy half of this. Credit buys the other half, provided you do not vanish." The white eyebrow rose. He drew a line beneath the total. "That is not a recommendation, but it will serve." He opened an account under her name and set an old green book on the counter. The cover read Practical Repairs for Rural Buildings, 1949 edition. A water stain had blurred the bottom corner. "My brother learned roofing from that book," Walter said. "He also learned several things the book got wrong. Bring questions before you climb." Sylvie paid $6.25 for a chimney brush, $3.80 for 2 lengths of threaded rod, $2.10 for a steel scraper, $4.60 for stove cement, and $1.35 for a galvanized bucket. Walter added cotton work gloves, a coil of rope, and the repair manual without entering them on the receipt. Back at the studio, she tied the brush to one rod, then the second, checking each coupling twice. She spread an old flour sack across the cold firebox, climbed the chimney from the roof's southeastern edge, and lowered the brush until the bristles met resistance. The first pull brought up dry flakes. The second released a black sheet of creosote that fell through the flue with the noise of broken china. For 4 hours she worked the brush down and back, one foot braced against a roof seam, her gloves darkening with soot. Near the lower bend, the rods stopped. She did not force them. She climbed down, reached through the clean-out with the scraper, and removed a compacted nest of twigs, paper, and chestnut hulls cemented together by tar. Behind it, the flue opened. She repeated the brushing until the falling soot became powder instead of scales, then inspected the firebox joints with a mirror. 2 had opened wide enough to show daylight. She pressed stove cement into them with a putty knife, smoothed the edges with a wet finger, and waited until morning before testing anything. The first fire was no larger than both her hands. She used dry walnut twigs, watched the smoke lift, and held a strip of newspaper near the opening to confirm the draft. The paper bent steadily inward. Nothing leaked into the room. She fed the flame one split stick at a time. By noon, the iron stove gave off enough warmth to loosen the stiffness in her shoulders. Sylvie boiled water, stirred oats into the kettle, and added half an apple cut with her sewing scissors. Steam clouded the nearest window. She ate from the kettle with a wooden spoon, while her wet socks dried across a chair rung. It was the first hot meal she had eaten indoors without being required to leave afterward. That afternoon, She began the workroom inventory. She chose only what could be handled safely and wrote each item in the back pages of Walter's manual. A bench shear with one sharpened blade, a wooden forming mallet worn flat on one side, 4 zinc pattern plates showing rosettes and beadwork, a soldering iron with a turned ash handle, a box of square-cut tacks, 2 lead-filled stamping hammers, and a rack containing 7 male dies whose matching female forms were missing. Against the southern wall stood the die press. Its frame had been cast in one piece, with Mercer and Sons raised along the arch. The flywheel measured nearly 5 feet across. A leather drive belt hung stiff and broken from a ceiling pulley. Beneath the press bed, dried oil formed a black rim around a circular plate that seemed too clean compared with the surrounding iron. Sylvie wiped it with kerosene. The plate was cedar, not metal, darkened to resemble the machine. It was 6 inches wide and fitted into the press column without visible fasteners. At its centre, someone had carved the same 8-point rosette she had seen on the auction notice. She tapped the iron beside it with the handle of the scraper. The column answered with a high, rigid note. When she tapped the cedar disc, the sound was dull. She pressed against it. Nothing moved. Then she set the galvanized bucket on the platform scale, balanced the arm, and recorded its empty weight. After filling the bucket with loose iron scraps from beneath the bench, she weighed it again, carried it to the press, and rested it on a narrow ledge inside the lower frame. The machine shifted almost imperceptibly toward the back wall. Sylvie removed the bucket and pushed again with her shoulder. The press returned. There was weight concealed inside the column, but not fixed weight. She examined the rosette more carefully. One point was shallower than the others. She inserted the tip of Amos's old seam gauge, which she had carried for years in the apron pocket, and turned it clockwise. A click travelled through the press. The cedar disc released into her palm. Behind it was a cavity lined with oiled tin. 3 packages had been fitted inside so precisely that none could settle or rattle. The largest was wrapped in waxed canvas and tied with linen cord. A second bundle had been covered in brown paper and sealed with red shellac. The smallest was a square tin box with solder around every seam. Sylvie carried them to the work table but did not open them at once. She swept the surface, washed her hands at the pump, then laid Amos's apron across the boards. The canvas package came first. She loosened the cord rather than cutting it, and folded the wrapping back along its old creases. Inside rested a set of stamping tools, 3 polished chasing hammers, steel punches shaped for beads and leaves, a narrow throat gauge, and a pair of hand snips bearing the initials EM. Each tool had been coated in tallow and wrapped separately in cotton. The paper bundle held 12 unused sheets of soft tinplate, each 14 inches square, with tissue between them. Beneath the metal lay 2 small match dies for an 8-point rosette. Their edges were still exact. The tin box required more patience. Sylvie warmed the solder with the old iron over the stove and lifted it in short sections, careful not to bend the lid. When the final seam released, the box opened with a breath of dry cedar and paper. Inside were cloth rolls, a military medal, a sealed envelope, and a handwritten journal bound in cracked black leather. She left the envelope unopened. The first cloth roll contained $20 gold pieces, each separated by a square of muslin. The second held $10 eagles and $5 half eagles. A small cotton sack contained Morgan's silver dollars, their edges grey with age. Beneath them were several $2.50 quarter eagles wrapped in newspaper dated 1947. Sylvie counted once, wrote the figures down, then counted again. The total was $21,576. She checked it a third time because the amount seemed deliberately uneven, as though someone had stopped saving on a particular day rather than aiming for a clean number. Beside the coins lay a purple heart in a worn leather case, engraved on the reverse with Thomas E. Mercer and the year 1944. Patterns. Occam's families served. Names filled the opening pages: churches, shopkeepers, mine offices, schoolhouses, private homes. Each entry listed a pattern, sheet thickness, number of panels, and whether the customer had paid in money, produce, labor, or time. It was not merely a business record. It was a history of roofs beneath which people had married, mourned, eaten, argued, and grown old. The envelope rested beneath the journal. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 4 words: "For the one who returns." Sylvie set it beside the stove. Outside, evening had lowered into the hollow. She carried the medal, still in its case, to the back door, but left the coins and tools inside. Laurel Creek ran high from the week's rain, brown water folding around pale stones. She sat on the bank until cold reached through her trousers. She did not open the letter. The studio windows behind her held the firelight in small amber squares, and for the first time the building looked occupied from the road. What is made carefully can still carry a life forward. At dawn, Sylvie carried the envelope to the work table and held it near the window. The blue ink had feathered into the paper, but the narrow capitals were unmistakable. Amos had written grocery lists, birthday cards, and measurements in that same hand, pressing harder on every final stroke, as though a sentence should be fastened down. She broke the seal with the seam gauge. "My dear one, whoever you are, Dr. Helen Ward at St. Mary's Hospital in Huntington tells me the cancer has entered my liver and gives me perhaps 4 months. That was in August. I'm writing in October because dying has made me slower, not wiser, and there are things I should have said while my hands still worked without trembling. Our trade began with Gideon Mercer, who came from Lancaster County to Mercer County in 1891 and cut his first ceiling dies from salvaged rail steel. His daughter Lydia Mercer learned the press in 1898 and kept the accounts when women's names were left off shop signs. Lydia's son Enoch expanded the patterns after returning from France in 1919. Enoch taught my father, Samuel, who taught me Amos Mercer, born in Hinton in 1934, 4 generations, several counties, and more stubbornness than money. Mercer Ornamental Metalwork closed on November 17th. 1978. The press had been silent for 34 years when I hid these things. I came back once each spring to oil the dies, though I told no one. Silence can protect an object, but it can also bury a family. My Uncle Thomas was killed in France during the Second World War. The Purple Heart belongs to him. He was 22. He could lay a tin panel without leaving one hammer bruise, and he whistled badly while he worked. If you use the old stock, warm it to at least 60 degrees before stamping. Cold tin fractures along the bead. Mix 1 part sal ammoniac with 8 parts water when cleaning the soldering iron, and dry it before returning it to heat. For flat seams, hold the iron no longer than 3 breaths in one place. When setting a ceiling panel, leave 1/16 of an inch at the wall for movement, even when the customer insists the fit should be tight. The money came from repairs paid in cash, and from coins my father refused to spend. Use it to keep the roof sound, the chimney honest, and your hands supplied. Do not mistake ownership for inheritance. Inheritance is knowing how to prepare the bench for the next worker, how to sharpen the tool without changing its shape, and how to leave enough material for another attempt. Behind the studio, near the creek, you will find a granite marker beneath the western walnut. Lydia set it there when the shop survived the flood of 1901. Clean the moss from the face. The mark will tell you which way the first panels were aligned. If you're one of ours, forgive us for making you search. If you're not, then perhaps work has made a larger family than blood ever managed. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. October 26, 2012. Sylvie read the letter twice. The second time, she placed one finger beneath each technical instruction as she had done when Amos taught her to read a ruler. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, returned them to the envelope, and held the packet against her chest only long enough to flatten the air from it. Outside, the morning was clear and painfully cold. She walked through the back door, past the pump, and followed the creek toward the western walnut. Brambles covered the base of the trunk. Beneath them, half buried in leaf mould, lay a rectangular granite marker no larger than a breadboard. She cleared it with her gloves and poured water across the face. An 8-point rosette had been carved into the stone. One point extended farther than the rest, aimed northeast toward the studio. Along its edge, nearly erased by weather, were the words "Begin the first row here." Sylvie looked from the marker to the building. The long wall faced the indicated line exactly. Lydia had not marked a grave or a boundary. She had left an instruction for a ceiling no longer there. Back inside, Sylvie opened the canvas bundle and selected the smallest chasing hammer. Its ash handle had darkened where generations of thumbs had rested. She warmed the head beside the stove, rubbed away the tallow, and lit Amos's old soldering iron in a shallow tray of charcoal. The copper tip changed slowly from brown to dull red, returning heat to a tool that had waited longer than she had been alive. As the charcoal caught, she remembered Lucille keeping $1 in her desk drawer, Walter opening credit without proof, the woman in the green cardigan raising 2 fingers beside her woodpile, and the bus driver who had waited while Sylvie dragged her suitcase from the luggage compartment. None had rescued her. Each had simply placed one small useful thing within reach. Perhaps someone once did that for you. What was the smallest kindness you received when you had almost nothing? And do you still remember the person's hands, voice, or face? That night, Sylvie wrapped the hammers and punches in clean cotton and placed them beside her bedroll. The journal rested beneath the work table, the letter inside Amos's apron pocket. She slept with one hand near the tools, listening to the creak and the first careful ticks of cooling copper. The first snow arrived on December 2000, 6 inches falling before noon and settling inside the open roof as neatly as flour in a bin. Sylvie stood beneath it with Walter's repair manual open on the work table and read the roofing chapter 3 times, once for sequence, once for measurements, and once for the mistakes hidden between the lines. The studio roof measured 28 by 20 feet along the slope, enough for 14 squares of felt, 7 bundles of 3-tab shingles, and roughly 12 pounds of galvanized roofing nails after allowing for overlap and waste. The damaged rafter had split beside the chimney, so Sylvie cut a sister rafter from dry pine and bolted it alongside the original before laying the first strip of felt. Walter arrived carrying a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle. "My brother's," he said. "He won't ask for it back." An hour later, Ezra Cole, a retired roofer of 76, appeared in a wool cap and refused the money Sylvie offered. He snapped a chalk line across the first course and showed her the rhythm of driving each nail, 1 stroke to set, 1 to sink, 1 to finish flush. "That nail's proud," Ezra said. Sylvie looked along the course. They worked 11 days through thin sun. Sleet and wind that lifted loose felt like a living thing. Ezra steadied ladders but never took the hatchet from her. By December 14th, the final shingle lay flat beneath the ridge cap, and the studio held silence when the next snow began. January exposed what firelight had concealed. Bricks above the roofline had begun to spall, their faces breaking away in thin red shells, while mortar inside the joints had softened into powder that ran beneath Sylvie's fingertips. She removed only the failed material, brushing each joint clean before rebuilding it with 2 parts hydraulic lime, 1 part fire clay, and enough washed sand to make the mortar hold a trowel mark without cracking. Walter warned her against ordinary cement, which would cure harder than the old brick and force the next freeze through the softer clay. For 3 weeks, temperatures stayed in the 20s. Sylvie mixed small batches inside, carried them up beneath a canvas windbreak, and worked barehanded because gloves dulled the pressure needed to pack the narrow joints. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb. She climbed down, held them near the stove until they hurt, then returned to the scaffold. She reset 9 bricks, rebuilt the chimney crown with a slight slope, and sealed the flashing where the new shingles met the masonry. On January 27th, she lit a test fire using dry walnut and a single sheet of newspaper. The smoke rose without hesitation. Outside, it left the chimney in one clean grey line. The white pine floorboards had darkened beneath generations of oil, soot, and boot polish. Hand-cut rosehead nails rose in places where the wood had shrunk, their black heads catching the edge of Sylvie's broom. She rented a random orbit sander from Walter for $14 a day and began with 80 grit paper, moving slowly enough to keep the surface level. The second pass, at 120 grit, removed the swirls and exposed narrow bands of pale grain. The final 220 grit left the board smooth without erasing the shallow dents around the press. Dust entered everything. Sylvie tied a damp cloth over her mouth, emptied the collection bag every half hour, and set each proud nail below the surface with a narrow punch before the sander could strike it. She wiped the floor clean and applied 3 coats of oil, rubbing each one along the grain and waiting 48 hours after the last. As the finish cured, the boards shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, revealing knots and saw marks that had been invisible beneath the grime. One morning she woke unable to lift the sanding block. She carried coffee to the marsh beyond the creek and watched a great blue heron stand motionless in shallow water. It took one deliberate step in nearly an hour. Sylvie did no work that day. There were 8 windows in the studio. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner, and one held a wavy original pane dated 1788 in pencil on the sash. Sylvie removed that pane first, wrapped it in 2 wool blankets and stored it flat beneath the workbench while she repaired the frame. She stripped the remaining sashes with a heat plate instead of a torch, softened the old glazing, and lifted each fragment without widening the rabbets. For the new panes, she rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms, pressed a thin bedding line into the wood, set the glass against it, then drove glazier's points every 8 inches before shaping the outer bevel with a putty knife dipped in linseed oil. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, threading each line over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot at the counterweight so it could not slip under strain. By the last window, the February light had begun to lengthen. Sylvie reset the preserved 1788 pane in the eastern sash, leaving every ripple and seed bubble intact. As she smoothed the final bead of putty, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. It turned once toward the glass, small and steady against the cold, while Sylvie held the knife still. The walls had been built with horsehair plaster pressed over hand-split oak lath, and most of it still held because the old builders had left enough tooth between coats. Near the chimney, however, heat and damp had opened 3 failures that crumbled each time Sylvie tried to feather a repair into the original surface. She removed the loose edges, dampened the lath, and began again with lime plaster strengthened by horsehair from an old burlap bag Walter found behind his stove. The scratch coat went on first and was scored with a notched trowel. Over it she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat, then waited 72 hours before applying the 1/8-inch finish coat. The new work dried paler than the old wall. Sylvie resisted tinting it. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said it quietly, with lime drying beneath her fingernails. Doris Bell from the corner shop cafe began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was a broad woman with flour always caught in the crease of one elbow, and each bag held something practical: bean soup in a jar, biscuits wrapped in wax paper, or 2 boiled eggs with salt folded into a paper twist. When Sylvie carried money into the cafe, Doris closed her fist around the coins and pushed them back across the counter. In Candles When the Shop Reopens, Caleb Hensley arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow-shouldered, and wore 1 red mitten and 1 brown one. Without waiting to be asked, he broke the walnut rounds behind the studio into stove lengths and stacked them beneath the repaired eaves. Sylvie offered him $5. He shook his head and kept his eyes on the woodpile. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Reverend Boyd passed along the creek road every morning at 7. He was tall enough that his trousers always seemed an inch too short, and he carried an ash walking stick polished by one hand. He never entered the studio. He merely tipped his hat, inspected the chimney smoke, and once, during a week of hard rain, helped Sylvie clear branches from the culvert. Before leaving, she placed 2 fingers against the doorframe. Sylvie postponed the cellar until February 11th, when the ground had softened enough to move the warped exterior hatch. 7 granite steps descended beneath the studio to a 12 by 15-foot room with a fieldstone floor and shelves cut directly into the foundation walls. At the centre lay a dressed granite slab marked with the 8-point rosette. Its edges were too exact to be ordinary flooring, but Amos's letter had said nothing about it. Sylvie swept the mark clean, tested the stone with her knuckles, and left it where it was. Beneath the 3rd step, her broom caught on something wooden. She worked a small oak box free from the packed dirt. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped like the rosette, along with a tintype wrapped in blue cloth. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the studio in the summer of 1903. She held a chasing hammer at her side and wore her dark hair drawn into the same severe part Sylvie saw in the mirror each morning. The resemblance was close enough that Sylvie had to place the image on the step before turning it over. Lydia Mercer, daughter of Gideon, age 25, summer of 1903. Sylvie carried the tintype upstairs and set it beside Amos's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel. She tried it in every cabinet, drawer, box, and door she could find. It opened nothing. By March, the snow withdrew into the deepest shade, and Laurel Creek grew loud enough to be heard from the road. Walnut catkins appeared like green cords against the dark branches, and water moved beneath the studio without entering it. Sylvie repaired the benches, sharpened the snips, and cleaned the smaller dies, but she did not begin a full ceiling. Amos had taught her that impatience damaged more material than ignorance. She selected one $5 gold piece from the cache and exchanged it through a reputable dealer for enough modern tinplate, solder, flux, and scrap steel to practice. Her first samples were no larger than dinner plates, some split at the bead, others warped beneath uneven pressure. She labelled each failure, dated it, and hung it beside the press. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sylvie completed her first full heritage craft piece. It was not a ballroom ceiling or a courthouse cornice. It was a 4-panel medallion for the front room, stamped from soft tin plate and joined around an 8-point center rosette. She warmed each sheet beside the stove before pressing, aligned the guide holes with a pin Amos had once carried, and stopped after every strike to inspect the bead. The panels were primed on both sides, painted a muted cream, and fastened over wood grounds with hand-cut nails placed where the pattern could hide them. When the last seam closed, afternoon light moved across the relief and gathered softly in the leaves. The restored interior remained spare. The front counter had been cleaned but not refinished. The white pine floor showed old boot dents beneath its oil. Walter's manual stood beside the journal, and the preserved 1788 pane still bent the eastern view into gentle waves. The die press occupied the workroom exactly where it had always stood, no longer silent. The brass key waited on the mantel until the following spring. Sylvie found its lock by accident while clearing storm-damaged bark from the western walnut. Beneath a loose section of iron banding around the trunk was a narrow brass plate, darkened almost black. The rosette-shaped bow fit into its center. The plate released a shallow compartment built into an old lightning scar cavity and sealed with beeswax. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, a packet of dried lavender, and a note written by Lydia Mercer in 1918. Lydia had addressed it to her brother Samuel, who was serving with the American Expeditionary Forces in France during the First World War. She wrote that the shop remained open, though steel was scarce and 3 church orders had been postponed. She had repaired the press belt with stitched leather, trained 2 widows to cut panels, and refused a buyer who intended to melt the dies for scrap. If you do not return, she had written, the work will still know your hands. I will keep the patterns together until someone comes who understands why they matter. Samuel returned in 1919. The flag had been his, folded after the armistice and hidden with Lydia's letter when the walnut was still young enough to heal over the compartment. Sylvie carried Thomas Mercer's Purple Heart to West Virginia National Cemetery in Grafton on May 30th, 2025, the traditional date once observed as Memorial Day. Reverend Boyd went with her but stood several rows away while she placed a small stamped tin rosette beside a veteran's marker and read Thomas's name aloud once. She never deposited the cash as ordinary money. 3 gold coins were sold over the next 2 years, each through documented appraisal. 1 paid for structural lumber and chimney scaffolding. 1 purchased a used roller, a sheet metal brake, and proper ventilation. The 3rd funded tin plate, fire insurance, and county inspection fees. A 4th coin was traded only when the well casing failed. The remaining coins returned to the soldered box. Sylvie added an updated inventory, copies of every receipt, and a note marked for the next one. Then she sealed the box with fresh solder and placed it inside the press column, behind the cedar disc. The studio reopened without a ceremony. A pairs? Small pountles, pattern matching. The first request came from a school custodian who needed 2 damaged ceiling squares copied for a hallway. The second came from a woman restoring her grandmother's pantry. By autumn, more than 40 names had been written into a mailing notebook, though Sylvie accepted only the jobs she could finish honestly. She delivered Doris a box of hand-poured beeswax candles wrapped in brown paper. Doris inspected them, nodded once, and placed one beneath the cafe's pie case before breakfast. Caleb returned after finishing trade school. He arrived in a work truck instead of on the Schwinn, though the mismatched mittens still lay on the dashboard. From the truck bed he lifted a carved poplar sign covered by a moving blanket. The top line reproduced the original studio name. Beneath it, in smaller letters, Caleb had added, Sylvie ran her thumb through the cut lettering. There are no daughters, she said. Not yet, Caleb answered. He mounted the sign beneath the old one, leaving both visible. The weathered metal named what the studio had been. The new wood allowed for what it might become. That winter, Sylvie began a letter of her own. My dear one, whoever you are, she wrote about the repaired roof, the chimney ratios, the safe operating pressure of the restored press, and the mistake she had made when she heated the first soldering iron too quickly. She listed the names of people who had helped without being asked to save her: Lucille, Walter, Doris, Caleb, Ezra, and Reverend Boyd. She did not explain every sorrow. A future worker would have sorrows of her own. Instead, Sylvie described how to read the walnut marker, where the water shutoff sat beneath the eastern shelf, and why the 1788 pane must never be replaced merely because its view was imperfect. She enclosed a photograph of herself holding the same chasing hammer Lydia had held in 1903. Near the bottom, she wrote one sentence exactly as Amos had left it. What is made carefully can still carry a life forward. She folded the pages along 3 deliberate creases and placed them inside a new envelope. For now, it remained in the center drawer of the front counter, beside the cafe mailing list and a sharpened carpenter's pencil. Outside, evening gathered along Laurel Creek. A chickadee crossed from one walnut tree to the other while smoke rose straight from the rebuilt chimney. Inside, the press completed one slow turn and stopped with the rosette die centered beneath the ram. The stamped tin ceiling studio waits. It has always waited. At the county office, Lucille Hale retired with the silver thimble still on her smallest finger. Before leaving, she cleared every drawer except one. There, beneath a copy of Sylvie Mercer's deed, remained the creased dollar bill from the $3 sale skept flat between two pieces of archival paper,